of introducing my friend Larry Lessig. There are a lot of people in the Legal Academy who are very smart and who have spectacular resumes, including in Larry's case, having clerked for Justice Antonin Scalia. There are not that many people in the Legal Academy who are so truly devoted in their careers to confronting objects of the highest importance and making a real difference. I think anybody, for example, interested in intellectual property would name Larry as the single most important figure in how we conceptualize, have grown to conceptualize intellectual property over the years. Part of Larry's significance is that he not only writes important books and teaches at important places like the Stanford Law School and Harvard Law School, where he is now, but he also gets himself involved with social movements. After climbing to the top in that area where most academics would have been free to remain, he really shifted his interest very sharply to another topic about which he feels very passionately, which is captured in the title of his book, Are We in Danger of Losing the Republic? And it is valuable that Mark Rosen, in his remarks a few moments ago, evoked a clause in the United States Constitution that is never taught, frankly, even at our nation's leading law schools, because the Supreme Court around 1849 or so basically read it out of the Constitution by saying, well, we're just not going to hear any claims brought on it. And what law professors teach their students is the parts of the Constitution that are actually litigated. And since Governable form of government is not litigated, we never bother bringing it up. But Larry is very, very much wrestling with what the term a Republican form of government can mean in the 21st century. It is also very interesting that at the age of 19, he was an alternate delegate to the Republican convention in 1980, where I presume he enthusiastically supported Ronald Reagan. I think his politics might have shifted at least a bit since then. But Larry really is somebody I'm proud to call a friend. We're going to co-teach a seminar in the fall at the Harvard Law School on what a new convention might look like. Had one, I think we should call it, So You Say You Want a New Convention. So he really is just a model citizen as well as an extraordinary academic. And I'm delighted to present him to talk about is the Republic still in danger of being lost, assimilating what we learned from the 2012.
So I'm grateful to Sandy for having me here. When he asked me, I think it was almost 17 years ago, to come speak, this is a well-planned conference. Of course, instantly I said yes. I was very happy to come, as much to celebrate the subject as to celebrate Sandy's extraordinary contribution to constitutional thought in the biggest sense of that. Not the Constitution, the document, but the thought of what it means to continue to keep constitutions alive. Now, when he asked me to come, he asked me, what do I want to talk about? And I've got to confess that I spend too much of my time away from my kids speaking about this issue. And the one thing I hate most of all is coming up with a title and describing what I want to talk about. Usually, the organizer then pesters me a million times. What's the title? What's the title? Sandy didn't pester me, and the result was this title. Just a kind of remix on my book's title, which of course I'm all in favor of, but it kind of forces me into a certain frame, which I embrace and I'm happy to take in trying to continue a conversation about how I think we should think about the problems that are at the center of this at this conference. And I guess I want to begin by saying what I fear as I listen to the debate in this academy in particular is that we over-intellectualize the problem. We make it seem like a harder intellectual problem than in fact it is. We think about members of Congress as if they're much more sophisticated creatures than the actual pedestrian characters that they are, and we don't allow our pedestrian understandings of how ordinary people function to inform us enough. I'm reminded of Pascal, in the context of Pascal's wager, describing how a person who didn't believe in God would come to believe in God. And he said, well, if you just act, if you sit down and pray enough and frequently enough, eventually you will believe. And I think that's the frame I want to push here. How do they act, and then what do they become because of what they act? How do they act as members of Congress? And as a consequence of that behavior, what should we expect they are? Now, to lay this argument out, I want to set up first what I think of as the problem. Some of you have seen this way I want to frame the problem, but I want to frame the problem in this way to crystallize a set of intuitions that I think we should have and not enough bring to this issue. So I want to tell this problem, describe this problem by first introducing a story. I was told by Walt Disney all stories have to begin like this. So once upon a time, there was a place called Lesterland. Sandy was very kind. He didn't tell you my first name is Lester. It's a secret. Please don't tell anybody. So I'm allowed to make fun of Lesters, and that's what I want to do. I want to make fun of Lesters here. So Lesterland. Lesterland looks a lot like the United States. Just like the United States, it has about 300 million people, and of the 300 million people, about 144,000 are named Lester. The internet told me that. Must be true. So that means about 0.05% of Lesterland is named Lester. Now here's the funny thing about Lesterland. Lesterland, not surprisingly, Lesters have a certain kind of power. There are 2 elections every election cycle in Lesterland. One is called the general election. The other is called the Lester election. In the Lester election, the Lesters get to vote. In the general election, all citizens over 18, in some states if you have an ID, get to vote. But here's the catch. To be allowed to run in the general election, you must do extremely well in the Lester election. You don't necessarily have to win, but you must do extremely well. Okay, that's the picture of democracy in Lesterland. What can we say about Lesterland? Well, I think we can say, number one, as the Supreme Court said in Citizens United, the people in Lesterland have the ultimate influence over the elected officials, because after all, there is a general election. But they have that influence only after the Lesters have had their way with the candidates who wish to run in that general election. And point number 2, obviously, this dependence upon the Lesters will produce a subtle, we could say understated, camouflaged bending to keep the Lesters happy. And point number 3, reform that angers the Lesters is likely to be highly unlikely. Okay, that's Lesterland. 3 things I want you to recognize about Lesterland. Number 1, the United States is Lesterland. The United States is Lesterland. The United States also looks like this, also has 2 elections. One election is called the general election. The other election we should call the money election. In the general election, citizens get to vote if you're over 18, in some states if you have an ID. In the money election, it's the relevant funders who get to vote. And as in Lesterland, the catch here is that to run in the general election, you must do extremely well in the Lester election. You don't necessarily have to win, not in all cases. There are Jerry Browns in this story as well. So not always, but usually. Usually. Now, that picture of the democracy, which is our democracy, has this one key feature to link it to the story I told you about Lesterland. There are just as few relevant funders in this democracy as there are Lesters in Lesterland. Are you saying, really? 0.05%? Well, here are the numbers from 2012. 0.3% of America gave more than $200 to any federal candidate in the 2012 election. 0.055 gave the maximum amount to any candidate in the 2012 election. 0.01 gave $10,000 or more to any set of candidates in the 2012 election. 0.0003% gave $100,000 or more to federal candidates in the 2012 election. Here's my favorite number, 0.000042%. For those of you doing the numbers, you know that's 159 Americans gave 60% of the super PAC money that was spent in the 2012 elections. So, I'm just a lawyer, but I look at this range of numbers, and I think it's fair for me to say 0.05% is a fair estimate, a lower bounds on the relevant funders in the system of democracy. These funders are our Lesters. Indeed, in this election, both Obama and Romney spoke of the extraordinary number of people who contributed small dollar contributions that totaled between the two campaigns $313 million. That $313 million was matched by the contribution of 34 Lesters. 34 Lesters contributed as much as all the people who gave less than $200 in this last presidential election. Now, like we'd say about Lesterland, this is what we can say about USA land. Number one, the Supreme Court's absolutely right. The people have the ultimate influence over the elected officials because there's a general election. But they have that influence only after the funders have had their way with the candidates who wish to run in that general election. And number two, obviously, this dependence upon the funders produces this subtle, understated, we could say camouflaged bending to keep the funders happy. Members of Congress and candidates spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. The Democratic leadership handed this document over to freshman Democrats just in January, describing to them what their schedule ought to be. 4 hours of their daytime work is devoted to the problem of raising money by calling people to give them money, of their work during the day. This doesn't include nighttime work, which of course is attending fundraisers. The largest, by two, a factor of two, thing they're supposed to do is to raise money. Now, as ordinary humans, we all get this. If you lived that life, we would develop, as anybody would develop here, a sixth sense, a constant awareness through this practice of how what we do might affect our ability to raise money. We would become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters. As we constantly adjusted our view in light of what we know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." And to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. And then point number 3, reform that angers the funders is likely to be highly unlikely in the USA as Lesterland. Okay, that's point number 1. The United States is Lesterland. Number 2, the United States is worse than Lesterland. Worse than Lesterland. Because you can imagine in Lesterland, if we Lesters got a letter from the government that says, you guys get to pick the candidates who will be the candidates that run in the general election. There are Lesters from every single part of society. There are black Lesters, there are white Lesters. Not many women Lesters, but put that aside for a second. But there's Lesters from all parts of society. You can imagine, it's at least possible we would develop a kind of aristocratic attitude. It's our job to think in the interest of Lesterland as a whole. It's at least possible that the Lesters in Lesterland would act for the good of Lesterland. But in our land, in this land, in USA land, the relevant Lesters here act for the Lesters. Because the shifting coalitions of interest that comprise the 0.05% are comprising that number not because they have the public interest in mind, it's because of the issue they know is right over the horizon for Congress in the next session. So if it's climate change legislation, it's coal companies, oil companies that comprise a significant portion of the Lesters. If it's healthcare reform, it's doctors and insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies that comprise a significant portion of the Lesters. These people comprising the 0.05% are acting not in the public interest. This is the sense in which the USA is worse than Lesterland. And then finally, point number 3. Whatever one can say about Lesterland, against the background of its traditions, blah, 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 in our land, in USA land, Lesterland-like government is a corruption. Now, by corruption, I don't mean brown paper bag corruption, people handing out cash to members of Congress against the laws of bribery. I don't mean Rob Blagojevich corruption. I'm not speaking of any violation of any criminal law. Indeed, everything I'm talking about, I'm happy to stipulate, is perfectly legal. Nothing I'm describing violates the law. Instead, this is a corruption relative to what I believe is a framer's baseline for how the structure of incentives for this government was to be set. The framers gave us what they called a republic. But as they explain again and again, by a republic, they invoke the idea of a representative democracy. And as Madison describes in Federalist 52, by a representative democracy, he means a democracy that would have a branch that would be, quote, dependent upon the people alone. Right, so here's the model of government. The people, the government. I do my own slides. It's really cool the way that bounces like that, right? So the people, the government. And it's through that exclusive dependency so the public good would be found. But of course, here's the problem. Congress has evolved a different dependence. Not a dependence upon the people alone, but a dependence upon the funders too. This is a dependence too. But it's a different and conflicting dependence from a dependence upon the people alone, so long as the funders are not the people. This is a corruption. And I want to give it a name to help understand the rest of what I want to argue about today. I want to call it dependence corruption. It's a corruption of the intended dependence this branch of government was meant to have. Okay, now, this word is significant, or in this font. This is the Supreme Court's font. Okay, so in the Supreme Court's font, this word is very significant. Because if you can predicate some practice, you can predicate corruption of some practice. If it's corruption, then Congress has more regulatory freedom to deal with that practice. In particular, you can have permissible speech regulation if it's corruption. If it's corruption, then there's a lot Congress can do that it otherwise is not permitted to do. So that pushes a very significant question. What does the word, quote, corruption mean? And the simplest conception of what it means is what we think of as quid pro quo corruption or influence peddling corruption. So you ask, why is that kind of corruption not permitted, or that kind of influence not permitted in our system? I think the point is that at the level of the individual representative inside of our government, this demonstrates a wrong kind of dependency. Whatever else is supposed to be allowed to influence the representative, it can't be this. If this is the equation describing, just so I get the economoids on my side for a second, the equation describing all the influences that might be operating on a representative as a representative decides what she wants to do, personal financial gain is just not allowed to be among those things. It's the wrong dependency and therefore permissible to regulate against it and against the appearance of this kind of dependency inside the decision functions of our representatives. So if you think about First Amendment corruption, by which I mean the kinds of thing the court recognizes as corruption for the purpose of allowing regulation of speech, the First Amendment notwithstanding, quid pro quo corruption is the simplest, most obvious case. Now, for a time, there was a different kind of corruption that the court recognized, what we could just call inequality corruption. Based on the work of some of the people who are here, the court embraced the idea, explicitly in Austin versus Michigan, that when somebody was acting on the basis of unequal speech resources that in part were caused by the state, then that was a kind of corruption that the state could intervene to correct. So if the state protected an entity by giving it the status of a corporation, giving it limited liability, and that led to it having resources it otherwise wouldn't have, the state would have the right to come in and say, okay, therefore we're allowed to limit your speech rights to balance that unequal advantage we have given you through our state action. And of course, that conception of corruption is what the Supreme Court in Citizens United overruled. It said whatever that was, that thing which the conservative justices couldn't even conceive, what it was that they were talking about, that was overruled so that this idea of inequality is now clearly, plainly not part of the permissible corruptions that might ground the right of a Congress to regulate, to address a problem in the way that the elections might be functioning. But what I'm suggesting, and the first point that I want to make very strongly here, is what I think they should see, what the Supreme Court should see, is distinct from these two ideas, quid pro quo corruption and inequality corruption. They should recognize dependence corruption. Recognize dependence corruption. So if quid pro quo corruption says at the level of the individual, this is a wrong dependency, whatever else can influence the individual, it can't be this meaning personal financial gain, then what dependence corruption says is at the level of the institution. The wrong dependency cannot be allowed to obtain. Whatever else can influence the character of representation, it can't be this Lester-like dependence. That Lester-like dependence is the wrong kind of dependency, and Congress should be permitted, subject to all the constraints of the First Amendment, to regulate, to eliminate this kind of corruption. So I'm going to call this dependence corruption, and I'm going to suggest that it is perfectly consistent with the reasons the court sets up for permitting Congress to regulate quid pro quo corruption, for it also to allow Congress to regulate, to eliminate dependence corruption. Okay. I mapped that idea out in my book, Republic Lost. There's some pushback to the idea. And the strongest pushback, Rick Hazen wrote a really great review in the Harvard Law Review that makes this argument quite powerfully. The biggest pushback is dependence corruption is actually just inequality corruption. I say there's a distinction between the two. He says there isn't a distinction between the two. And I confess that it's possible the court would not see any distinction. They're getting old, their glasses don't work well anymore, so they might sort of blur them together. And they would blur them together because, of course, dependence corruption is related to the ideas of equality. It's related because the wrong dependence I've identified here is a wrong dependence because not everyone within the Republic could be a Lester. Not everybody within the public could be giving $10,000 to candidates to run for office. Not all of us have that kind of resource. So it's that inequality that sets up the impropriety of the dependence. And so in this sense, there is something related to equality in the conception of dependence corruption. And it's also true, the Supreme Court has gone completely insane in its thinking about equality in the context of election law. I mean, the most extreme example was this recent case, Arizona Free Enterprise, where the Chief Justice said to the party defending the law, I went onto your website, and I found on your website in some place the claim that this law was designed to level the playing field. And therefore, I know this law was motivated by equality, and since it was motivated by equality, the law must be unconstitutional. Creating a bizarre constitutional standard which says that if equality was anywhere in the motivation behind a law, it is per se unconstitutional. Even if it's not the intent of the law, even if it's just an effect of the law, it is unconstitutional. Now, this is crazy talk. I can't actually believe the court is going to go that far or maintain that kind of extreme position. It's inconsistent with its own earlier conception of the way to regulate in the context of voting law. So, for example, if money is speech, which of course the court in Buckley affirmed it is, then of course the votes are speech as well. So consider the vote-speech battle that came to a head in the case of Reynolds versus Sims, where there was lots of inequality in the relative power of a vote caused by the failure of states to apportion the votes equally. So some voters had 10 times the power with their vote that other voters had. The court looked at that, and the court said, well, the conception of political equality from the Declaration of Independence to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address to the 15th, 17th, 19th Amendments can only mean one thing: one person, one vote, aka leveling the playing field. That was the constitutional requirement in the context of this speech resource. It's required that we mandate states keep within a tiny, tiny parameter of this obligation. But in the context of speech that comes through money, there is no possibility that we can be advancing this equality conception. So my view is this crazy talk by the court won't continue that far. And I do think these two conceptions are analytically distinct, the equality conception and the dependence corruption conception. Not all inequality is an improper dependence. There's plenty of cases of inequality that don't manifest improper dependence. And some proper dependence will produce inequality. So, for example, if the state of Michigan, instead of being worried about the corporations in Michigan having too much power, said we're worried about unions having too much power because they have a very easy ability to organize people to turn out to vote, and the state had tried to address that inequality, I don't think dependence corruption would have authorized the state to address that kind of inequality, because that kind of inequality is precisely the kind of inequality that a voting system is supposed to ratify. Now, instead, I think the problem with equality that the court has is what we could call the Demosthenes reductio. Remember, Demosthenes is an orator who's so good that eventually they require him to put rocks in his mouth before he's allowed to speak, so he brings him down to the level of everybody else. And I think that's the kind of anxiety the court has when it thinks about this equality rationale justifying intervention in the speech market. And I just don't think the dependence corruption justification has the same Demosthenes reductio implication. So I think dependence corruption is a distinct conception of corruption, distinct from inequality, distinct from quid pro quo. And the important thing is the court could embrace it consistent with Citizens United. Because Citizens United does not get decided differently under the conception of corruption that I've described. Because whatever dependence corruption is, the idea that a nonprofit filmmaker gets to spend its money to promote its film does not implicate in any sense of my conception what I'm talking about as dependence corruption. So it's perfectly consistent with Citizens United, though it's not consistent with another case familiar to many people here, the Speech Now case from the DC Circuit, which I think would have to be reversed. So I think the court can, I think the court should recognize dependence corruption as a distinct conception of corruption. When I was younger, more idealistic, I would have said then the court will, but you see that idealism's a little bit faded for me right now, so I won't actually make that prediction here. Okay, so that's dependence corruption. My claim is this kind of corruption has an effect. And as relevant to this conference, I believe it has the effect of rendering us, or explaining part of what renders us, ungovernable. Now, this comes in two parts. One is because of the perception that this kind of economy of influence creates. As I've said again and again, many people affirm Americans believe because of this kind of economy, and I think Americans are right that it's a separate question. Let's focus on what they believe, that, quote, money buys results in Congress. For the poll that I did for my book that was released last fall, 75% of Americans affirmed that statement. A little bit higher Democrats than Republicans, but I guarantee you before the Republicans took control of the House in 2010, it was just as many Republicans as Democrats. So whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, here's the one thing we as Americans all believe: money buys results in Congress. And they've also said that I believe that belief weakens trust in the institution of Congress. Sandy pointed to statistics which are about the performance of Congress. ABC News and New York Times had a different poll last year where they found that 9% had confidence in Congress, trusted Congress in this sense. Sandy invoked this claim, which I want to make much more strongly. If we put this in context, I think it's certainly the case that a higher percentage of Americans had confidence, trusted the British Crown, than trust our Congress today. And that leads to claim number 3. I said this weakened trust weakens participation. Many instances, suggestions of this. Rock the Vote, which organizes young voters, turns out young voters. 2008 turned out the largest number of young voters in the history of voting. Found in 2010 a significant number of the young voters weren't going to show up, so they polled them to ask them why. Number one reason by far, 2-to-1 of the second highest reason was, quote, no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have power, too much power, and prevent real change. And it's not just kids. The vast majority in 2010 who could have voted did not vote, in part, I think, because of this belief. And in this election, 40% of the people who could have voted did not vote, in part, I think, because of this belief. That's the perception claim. And it's important to recognize we're not talking about mere perception. It's not mere perception because this perception has a real effect. It has an effect, and I think that effect is reason enough to think about how we might change it. Justice Souter in Nixon versus Shrink, Missouri, put it this way: leave the perception of impropriety unanswered and the cynical assumption that large donors call the tune could jeopardize the willingness of voters to take part in democratic governance. And if Souter says it, it must be true. Okay, now, there's pushback here too. People have asked the question, does money actually weaken trust? Or does the collapse of trust correlate with money? Because after all, if you look at the Gallup polls, and you see the collapse of trust, and you overlaid on top of this the rise in money, it wouldn't be necessarily a perfect correlation, even as a lagged function, not a perfect correlation. As Rick Hasen summarizes Nate Persley and Kelly LeMay's paper, no good evidence, as he says, of a correlation between campaign finance law and public trust exists. And number two, does this weaken trust, weaken participation? There's a great new paper that just came out by a local, Darren Shaw, which looks at a bunch of attitudes around campaign finance and reaffirms much of what I've said, but this is the one that the authors push back most strongly on. They find evidence to support the idea that the more one believes the political process is corrupt, the more likely one is to engage in political activity, exactly the opposite of the concern that I've described. But in the face of this, I think, again, as academics, we have to step back and think, what is the appropriate tool for understanding the behavior or the attitudes that we're speaking of? Because number one, we have a problem of confounding facts. The claim that changes in campaign finance laws don't seem to increase trust confounds with another fact that Claris recognized last year. Claris was a polling organization, did a poll last summer. They asked the question, do you think these laws, campaign finance laws, have been designed more to help current members of Congress get reelected, or do you think these laws have been designed more to improve the system? 80% of Americans affirmed the cynical view of why Congress passes campaign finance laws. So if 80% of us believe that they only pass these laws to help themselves, it's no surprise that campaign finance laws don't produce an increase in trust. And I also think there's a wrong level of analysis going on here. We have too much macro analysis when we need more micro analysis. And at the center that I run at Harvard, the Edmund J. Safra Center, we have a lab focusing on this general problem, what we call institutional corruption. There's been a lot of research we've helped support. This is, I think, among the most interesting, trying to understand how people's judgment about confidence in claims by supposedly respectable institutions is affected by the perception of a relationship to a financial interest. In this study, the researchers got actual doctors, clinicians, to read summaries of research about hypothetical drugs. I mean, they thought they were real drugs, but anyway, the description of the drugs included a description of the testing methods. So was it gold standard test or medium or not a very good kind of test? And it included in the description mentioning of whether it was government funded or industry funded or didn't mention funding at all. So after running thousands of these surveys to these doctors, what they could conclude and demonstrate conclusively in the statistics is industry sponsorship reduces the doctor's willingness to believe and act on the trial findings independently of the trial's quality. Even if it was a gold standard trial, the most reliable kind of trial that you could be, still the doctors, the people who actually rely upon this research, were less willing to trust the claims than they would have been if the funding had been independent. We, Mazreen Banaji and I, did a similar study that looked at a bunch of different contexts and also found a similar relationship. All that you had to do was to suggest a financial incentive to significantly influence the participants' trust and confidence of the claims that were being made in the context of medical research, in the context of consumer products, and in the context of politics. Now, I think against the background of this micro research, meaning research about how attitudes are actually affected by this kind of experience, it would be weird to conclude that though people are less trusting of their doctors or less trusting of medical research, they are not less trusting of members of Congress when I find out that members of Congress have this indirect financial interest in the positions which they are advancing. And then third, finally, I worry that we're looking at the wrong kind of corruption in some of these analyses. So in the paper by Shaw, which basically concludes, the more you're convinced they're bums, the more you want to throw them out, even if they're all bums. And I think many of us had this experience around this election. You could look at both the Democrats and the Republicans and think that they are both equally as committed to the current system of funding elections. So from the perspective that I care about, neither of them is innocent. But still, I have a strong reason to turn out and vote for one side versus the other, given there is no alternative in this system. But if you think of trust here, or the reason to turn out, is less about whether we can make intra-marginal gains, but more about the efficacy of my participation, And people like Fatterson have done work that shows that distrust, as in lack of political efficacy, is linked to these lower participation rates. And this is, again, I think not terribly counterintuitive. And sometimes I fear in this context that we have what I could call the academic's fallacy. The academic's fallacy is that there is no truth unless it's counterintuitive. So to answer this fallacy, let me just say, counterintuitively, that's not true. Okay, that's the perception side. Let's talk a little bit about the reality side, the reality of the economy that's functioning here. Because I think that this corruption has a particular economy. And it's that economy that contributes to the ungovernability which we're talking about this weekend. And there are two aspects of this economy. One is the economy of what I want to call no, and the second is the economy of extortion. So first in the context of the economy of no. Anytime you have a system where this tiny, tiny fraction exercise this disproportionate influence, it's going to follow that a tiny number of that tiny fraction is going to be enough to block any change. Always, or at least almost always, unless some exogenous event happens, like the Republicans discovering they're going to be extinct unless they start talking sensibly about immigration, or a tragedy like Sandy Hook. Except for those exogenous shocks to the system, it's always going to be the case that these small number of Lesters will be able to band together to block any sort of change. And that points to a particular instability of the government that we have allowed to evolve, this instability of this economy of no. Because this economy depends upon polarization. The economy that tries to sell the ability to block change, it depends upon polarization. It depends upon dysfunction. The more dysfunctional the system, the easier it is to sell the ability to block change. Dysfunction is the business model. As Li Fang in The Nation described, he scraped from a website something that was quickly removed by the lobbyists on that website. Lobbyists were advertising their service. Steve Duffield is this lobbyist here, and this was one of the services he advertised. Managing holds in filibuster. Your organization has an interest in a bill that has proven controversial, and you require advocacy before the legislatures, often backbench Senate Republicans who may exercise their prerogatives to delay or obstruct. Endgame strategies will give you a new way to manage your interest in a legislative environment that gives great power to individual senators. Their ability to sell their services depends upon the ability of single senators to stop the changes. And that economy then, within this economy, we facilitate the kind of economy of no that I'm describing. And when you step back then and think about all the issues any of us could care about, right? Whether it's healthcare reform on the left, or government bailouts on the right, or global warming legislation on the left, or a complex tax system on the right, or financial reform for the left, or financial reform for the right, what we recognize, what we should recognize, is there will be no sensible change in any of these areas until we change this corruption, because of the tiny number of Lesters that are needed to block that sensible change. This is the instability that the economy of no produces. And then there's the second economy, the economy of extortion. I've tried to focus you on the 0.05%, the Lesters, but think for a second about the 0.00014%, members of Congress, who represent 0.00014% of the American public. I've said they're dependent. But the dependent creates his own dependencies as a way to feed his dependence. So if you're an addict and you need to find a way to feed your addiction, best if you can create somebody else who's dependent upon you so that person has a reason to feed your addiction. So for example, 2 years ago, the Wall Street Journal was puzzled by this explosion in what they refer to as this temporary tax code and the increase in the number of extenders, what they called extender mania. And what this is referring to is the tax code has all sorts of little exceptions built into it, little exceptions that benefit some particular company or some kind of investment. And these exceptions have a limited life, so they expire at a certain point. And then at the end of that life, the decision Congress has got to make is whether to extend them again. And if they extend them, that's called an extender. And what the Wall Street Journal was puzzled by was the explosion in extenders. But from the perspective I'm offering, the explosion should be obvious, right? So temporary tax provisions are given to us initially by Ronald Reagan in 1981. The Research and Development Tax Credit is enacted. But there's an argument about whether it would work, so it was made temporary so that the economists could test it. And after a period of time, they would ask, did it work? and the economists would tell them whether it worked or not, and if it worked, they would make it permanent. And after a period of time, Republicans and Democrats alike agreed it worked. It made sense. It was absolutely an essential part of an efficient tax code. The puzzle is, it is still temporary to this day. It's still temporary. So why is it still temporary to this day? Well, as Rebecca Kaisar writes in the Georgia Law Review, the fact about the Research and Development Tax Credit is the principal recipients are large U.S. manufacturing corporations. These business entities are more than willing to invest in lobbying activities and campaign donations to ensure the continuance of these large tax savings. And the Institute for Policy Innovation, which has a little bit very realistic conception of how this actually works, describes it like this. This cycle has repeated for years. Congress allows the credit to lapse until another short extension is given, preceded, of course, by a series of fundraisers and speeches about the importance of nurturing innovation. Congress essentially uses this cycle to raise money for re-electing promising industry, more predictability the next time around. Congress makes the manufacturers dependent upon Congress, so the manufacturers feed Congress's dependency. Or think about it in the context of Medicare. What I love about Medicare is it's the only large organization in the world that doesn't have an official logo that has a high-quality resolution on the web. So this is all. There's something virtuous about that. Okay, so Medicare. Medicare in the late 1990s launched this program, the Sustainable Growth Rate Program. The design of it was that the amount that Medicare reimbursed doctors would decline over time. So every year there was a scheduled reduction. And then the question Congress had to face every year is, will they allow the plan to go into effect? But of course, what we see is every time this reduction is about to come into effect, the doc fix happens again. The doc fix refers to Congress at the very last moment passing a law that says we're not going to actually force doctors to take less money from Medicare. And what precedes the doc fix? Exactly the same kind of lobbying and fundraising activity to say to all the doctors, you know, we got to get the support we need to make sure that we don't have a reduction in the amount of money you're going to get as a doctor. Once again, a dependency created to feed the dependency that Congress has. Or the fiscal cliff legislation, of course, is the most dramatic of these. And you know, there were many of these things that were inserted in the bill at the last minute, while most of us were out celebrating. There were plenty of examples of tax extenders put in this bill. The doc fix was put in this bill. But the most dramatic, and really it shocked Senate staffers, so Senate staffers went to the New York Times secretly, anonymously to sort of get this out there, was this extraordinary gift given to drug manufacturers. Right? There's these drug Amgen, which is used for dialysis, that was scheduled to go into a lower price regime. 2 years ago, Congress gave it another 2-year extension where it didn't have to go into that lower price regime. This time they did it again in the fiscal cliff. Richard Painter, who was Bush's chief ethics officer, wrote this piece in the Legal Ethics Forum, calculating it was a 9,900% return, which this drug company got for the lobbying dollars they spent to get this inserted in the fiscal cliff. This single change will cost taxpayers $500 million over the next 2 years because of the refusal to change the way in which we are pricing that particular drug. Or it's not just in the context of taxes. All of you, of course, will recognize this as the Communications Act of 1934. That act, which has 6 different titles today. Al Gore, shortly after inventing the internet, had the idea that he wanted to take the internet-related titles and put them under a new title, Title VII. And Title VII would be fundamentally deregulated. So infrastructure provision of broadband would be fundamentally deregulated. But when his chief policy person took this idea to the Hill, as he reported back to me, the feedback from the Hill was, hell no. If we deregulate these guys, how are we going to raise money from them? Now again, this is the economy of extortion. And it's a kind of extortion that enables the fundraising, and I want to suggest the fundraising is the key, or the funding is the key. Or to invoke another favorite phrase, the funding is the root, in the sense that Thoreau spoke of when he spoke of the 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, to one striking at the root. We need to find a way to strike at this funding root. Okay. Now those claims too have a certain amount of pushback. Some in this room, many not in this room, argue, well look, no, money is a problem, but there are lots of other issues out there. The Senate is one of the biggest problems, more than money. Or the Republicans, as Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann bravely put it in their recent book, are the Republicans. Or polarization. is the problem. And my view is, no doubt all of these are problems. No doubt we've increased polarization, at least among the politically active class. But the question I think we need to focus is, what do we do about these problems, or which of these problems can we do something about? So how would you address polarization, for example? Remember in the Federalist Papers, Madison, in describing a faction, sets out his description of the faction and the problems factions are going to cause. And then to address the problems that factions are cause, you could say one thing we can do is remove the causes of factions. And the other thing we can do is by controlling the effects of factions. And of course, to remove causes would be pretty totalitarian, to force us all to be exactly the same, so he wants to deal with the effects. I thought that was an obvious response to that alternative. Then I found this thing on the internet, which is a little bit striking.
The first is an initiative called Mosaic Earth. The mission is very simple. We eliminate debate, and I mean this literally, in any area with any amount of emotionally charged, multi-layered problem that you can imagine.
So he's eliminated the causes. This Madison would have been very intrigued, I think, by this. I mean, you can tell me, Jack. But okay, so if we don't want to go down that path of the literal, as he says, literally removing all debates by, I don't know what he's going to do to us to make it so we don't disagree at all about anything anymore. Okay, if we're not going to do that, then what are we going to do consistent with underlying values of liberty and diversity? Because I think here, too, we could think about how to remove the causes of polarization. Like, here's one way the internet suggests. Texas could secede. That would remove a significant chunk of the cause of polarization. Or here's another idea. I love the internet. I just literally thought, has anybody put up a site for this? And the answer is yes. Invade Canada. That's another way to deal with the problem of polarization. We invade Canada, then we give them citizenship rights, and they're all liberals, so now we have a liberal state. So this is the point. These are ways we could deal with the polarization, but none of them are realistic ways to deal with the polarization. None of them are consistent with more fundamental values. So instead of those ways of dealing with polarization, we should think about ways that actually we could adopt or apply that would deal with the polarization. And I think changing the economy of fundraising is one way to deal with the polarization. Because what's striking about American politics is not that it's polarized, it's that it's inconsistently polarized, inconsistent with ideologies. So on the money issues, there's only one party in America, right? The Wall Street issue, 1990s, 2000s. There was only one party in America, the party that supported exactly what Wall Street was paying for in its regulation. It's on the social issues that it's polarized. But that pattern of polarization and non-polarization is perfectly consistent with a strategy to maximize fundraising capacity. Because with the business issues, you want to speak in a way that will get the businesses to pay you the most. With the social issues, you want to rally up the troops for your crazy side of the debate, whether it's pro-gay rights or anti-abortion. The point is that this strategy is at least correlates with the best strategy for funding. And I think it's the same point that we can make in the context of the other things identified as a problem. You might think Republicans are the problem, and in my post-Republican stage, I'd be happy to say we ban Republicans, but of course, that's not going to happen. We're not going to change Republicans affirmatively. In the same way with the Senate, we thought we were going to do something with the Senate, but it turns out we're going to do very little with the Senate. And you ask the question, how could the Senate give up what they recognize is this money printing machine, which they have with the capacity they have to sell the ability to say no? So I think we need to fix what we can fix. And one thing we can fix is the way we fund elections. And that's the reason why I continue to think this corruption has an effect that we need to take seriously. Okay. So if this is the problem, specifically, not the idea of money, or not the amount of money in politics, that's not the problem. If the problem is kind of disciplining practice, to invoke a Foucauldian-like conception of it, the problem is that members are spending tons of their time raising money from the tiniest slice of America, and we invoke the sense of Pascal in this and think of, they are here what they do. If this is what they're doing, spending all of their time raising the money from the Lesters, then what is the solution to that problem? What's not a solution, not even close to a solution, are the things that the Democrats push, for example, most strongly, the idea of disclosure. Disclosure doesn't address this problem at all because it doesn't change this dynamic at all. Same thing with Common Cause, out there with its Amendment 2012 strategy, or at least last year, that has as its idea, the solution to our problem is that these slogans, corporations are not people, or money is not speech, if we can only insert those slogans into our Constitution, we'll address the problem that is leading to the corruption of this democracy. But again, if the Constitution were amended tomorrow, and I hope it isn't, to say that money is not speech, I think money is speech, and I don't really care about the corporations as person thing, but if it were amended tomorrow in both of those ways, it would not change in one iota the way in which members of Congress are spending all of their time raising money from the tiniest slice of the 1%. So these are not changes. And then there are changes that aren't enough of changes. Some people are saying, well, then the solution here is just to eliminate all limits so that people can give as much money as they want, so that they don't give all their money to super PACs, so that candidates can control the funding more directly and actually spend less time fundraising. Because if you don't have to raise money from 50,000 Lesters, you only have to call 2 or 3, then you can spend more of your time doing other stuff. And that's true. That solution would deal with the problem of the amount of time that people spend raising money, but would also increase the corruption from the way that I've described it, because it would make our Congress dependent upon an even tinier slice of the American public. You know, the Adolfs, not the Lesters, the kind of the really, really tiny fraction of Americans who happen to be in the position to be able to fund these kinds of elections. Okay. Then people push matching funds. The Fair Election Now Act is this, that pushes more small contributions, but the problem is not necessarily more small contributors. So I think that drives us to say, well, then what would be enough? What changes here would be enough? And I think Ackerman and Ayer's idea, Rick Hassan also described this early on in this description of what we could call democracy vouchers, or democracy dollars is what he was talking about there. Basically vouchers that we give to voters that they can use to fund campaigns. In my book, I modify this a bit to say that the candidate's ability to take these vouchers is conditional upon the candidate agreeing to fund his or her campaign only with vouchers plus contributions capped at something like $100. These are systems for basically spreading the effective financial influence out to all of us. Congressman Sarbanes, son of Paul Sarbanes, John Sarbanes from Maryland, has a proposal called the Grassroots Democracy Act that was introduced in September. This has matching funds and a tax credit and a pilot program for vouchers, all designed to make it so that more citizens are engaged in the practice of being the relevant funders of campaigns, ideally all citizens becoming the funders, and not just the Lesters. Now, I think this is reason enough to push this, but there's another consequence of this alternative that I don't think people have focused on. I wonder whether the consequence of handing out vouchers to everybody and telling candidates you're going to fund your campaigns by raising money from everybody through these vouchers wouldn't create the incentives that the Australian voting system creates. The Australians require people actually show up to vote. They don't actually have to vote, but they have to show up to vote, which requires that candidates actually speak to a wide range of Australians because they know they'll be there at the polls. I wonder whether vouchers don't create the same dynamic. And the reason for thinking that is this. If we think about the elections that we have right now, the voting election is a discrete election. It happens, primary and the general, 2 days, that it happens every election cycle, and constitutionally mandated to be absolutely equal in the effect of the power that each of us have. The money election is continuous. It's an election that happens every single moment, or the 4 hours or 6 hours a day that a member of Congress spends calling people to raise money. It's continuous, but constitutionally fundamentally unequal. But the point is, if there were vouchers out there that people were constantly raising money from, this continuous election would be an election that would be enfranchising all people in the system. And the incentive of candidates who need to raise money from these vouchers would be like the incentives of candidates in the Australian system to speak to a wider range of the public in order to facilitate the funding for vouchers. So this effect might be to narrow the strategy of polarization, which I think is built into the current way in which we fund our double elections. Okay, one final point about this. So Sandy's question, is the Republic still in danger of being lost? Obviously, my view is yes. If by republic we think about a representative democracy, a democracy that's dependent upon the people alone, that republic has clearly been lost. But what I plead for is a sense of strategic clarity. What is the strategy that we could craft that might have a hope of getting it back? Thanks very much.
We'll break sharply at 2, but that gives us roughly 20 minutes for questions. I'm wondering, sorry, with Hillary, if we take roughly 4 questions at a time, Jim can respond to that group, and then go until 2, at which time we simply break.
Hi, my name is Matt Spitzer. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. I was just wondering about your opinion of the lowest unit charge regulation in Section 315, which guys like you and me know about, which basically requires that all candidates be charged the lowest possible charge for broadcasting time. And I'm asking about broadcasting now because, of course, if you ask where the money goes, ask people in Ohio, right? The money ends up in advertisements on every possible conceivable outlet you could possibly watch or listen to. You know, the FCC has stopped enforcing the lowest unit charge, and so would actually having a lowest unit charge that be enforced be part of this sort of equalization approach that you would suggest?
Let me ask you, there's one who has a question roughly along this line, so maybe the topics can be clustered. And if not, then Larry should just respond directly.
So I certainly think it would be better if the lowest unit charge were being enforced. It's of limited utility because, of course, it's not going to apply in lots of the contexts which are relevant, but it still would be valuable. But even if campaigns cost half as much as they cost, so long as candidates are raising money from the tiniest slice of the 1%, it's the same corrupting dynamic. So I agree we should find ways to make the system cheaper. That would be great. It would be great if we could do what Europe gets to do, which is basically take over television stations and mandate time that candidates have in long chunks to present their case. But even if we did that, still, as long as campaigns cost something and we raised money from the tiniest slice of us, the same corrupting dynamic.
Yes, I'm curious about an issue that hasn't been raised anywhere yet, and that is the ongoing wars. And I'm wondering, are the Lessers all warmongers? Or, because I don't see that there's any sort of movement by people in Afghanistan to hire lobbyists to go on Capitol Hill and have congressmen vote to drop bombs on their country.
Yeah,
and that's really the danger where the Republicans would be lost, it seems to me, is that we gets lost into a cycle of perpetual war.
Yeah. So, you know, of course, certainly Eisenhower, who gave us the slogan military-industrial complex, the original version of that slogan was military-congressional industrial complex. And he was pointing to exactly the same kind of concern about the military and the way the military might drive for its own self-interested reason by creating dependencies with Congress to increase its scope. And so there are lots of people doing work to demonstrate how that kind of corruption exists inside the military. I actually think, you know, there are certain areas in our government that might be relatively immune to the problem that I'm talking about. So in the context of administrative agencies, activity that's below the political noise level, which, you know, where the members are, nobody's paying attention to it. There are lots of great bureaucrats who are doing great work that's actually driven by what makes sense as opposed to anything that's affected by this. And I think there are lots of areas of foreign policy where the same kind of point might be said. I think Jack Goldsmith's latest book kind of suggests the way in which you can have sensible policymaking around this. But I will, you know, point to a particularly, I think, grotesque example of exactly the dynamic you're talking about. You know, if you think about the fight in Kosovo, the United States decision to militarily get involved in Kosovo, one way to understand that is it's, you know, one of the very, very few times in American history where we committed troops for what had to be just a humanitarian purpose. There was no strategic reason why we were going to get anything out of Kosovo. There was no oil in Kosovo, you know. So all the cynical assumptions about why we get involved didn't apply in that case. But there was a piece in the Times a couple months ago about how all of the public service contracts that are now being issued by the Kosovo government are being bid on by people who were affiliated with the Clinton administration. So people who were the Clinton administration now go over to Kosovo, start these firms, and then they bid on like telecommunication contracts or on contracts to deal with, you know, whatever other public infrastructure things they need. And I, you know, and if I were Clinton, I would be outraged at that, because, you know, the one thing of my legacy you could say that I was doing for the right reason now turns out, you know, Kosovars look at this and think, oh, I guess this is the way corruption happens in America. It's ex post rather than ex ante. So you pay the bribe after, not before. All right, fine. So, you know, you show up and you say you're a Clinton person. Of course, we got to do this. What else are we going to do? And that's I think a really disgusting dynamic that, you know, we should administration should have a very strong reason to
My name is Carl Jarvis. I'd like to, I guess, suggest a point of strategic clarity and get your thoughts on it, which is a point that you alluded to around the nominating process in the direct primary and the fundraising demands that creates on the part of candidates. And specifically, if you go back before the direct primary laws were enacted, when we had something like the convention system, a lot of that funding actually went through the parties. Candidates were not required to raise money on their own behalf. And if you look at a lot of these problems, I mean, everything from Watergate to a lot of the corruption issues that you discussed in your talk, the problem comes down to the candidates controlling the funds. And I could give a number of examples. I'm not going to take up time with that. But as far as this point of clarity, people talk about the convention system as being corrupt. I think that the problem that we have today is actually a lot worse under the direct primary. And as far as, I just want to say one final thing about that. Some people may say, well, you could never reenact the convention system, you could never reenact the indirect primary. The fact of the matter is, if you made a law like that optional, in other words, you allowed each party at its discretion to hold an indirect primary and hold a convention that actually selected candidates, and only one party opted to do that, that party would win the election for the simple reason of this dynamic around fundraising to get nominated, and also the dynamic around the issues in the moderateness of candidates. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not committed to the view, or it's nowhere close to my view, that there's just one problem in American politics. I think there's a whole slew of issues in American politics, and I would join with people who believe that the weakening of the party system is one of the problems, or I would say more precisely, the substitution of interested influence for the party influence is a problem. And you know, you've given me the introduction to your book in a handout, and I'm eager to look at it to see about this problem, because I've really not thought much about how to change the original primary system. It's convinced, you know, it's plausible that this would actually create a greater integrity in the system, more independence from money possible. So that could be one of the problems to solve. But the point I'm trying to emphasize is, what's the sequence of reform? What's the reform that would be generative of other reform? What's the reform that would make it possible to get to other places? And that's why I'm trying to pick on this one, that if we could make progress here, I think makes some of these other problems easier to handle. So if we change the way we fund elections, there would be no strong commitment to keeping the existing way of funding the primaries, because that would have been removed. So then why not think about other ways of running primaries that would create greater opportunity for parties to do the good work that you're suggesting they can do?
Larry, I just have a question which is maybe clarifying, which is whether you're making one proposal or two. So early in the talk, you talked about the prospect of the Supreme Court possibly recognizing dependent corruption, and then later at the end of the talk, you proposed this idea of vouchers, which I think is a very attractive idea. And I wasn't quite sure if they're connected or how they're connected exactly. Maybe you can say more about how they're connected.
So here's the link. So I think the voucher proposal, Ackerman's proposal, or the proposal I've outlined, is perfectly constitutional, even under this Supreme Court. But people ask the question, well, is it enough? Because if you have super PACs that get to spend unlimited amounts of money, maybe that scares people away from opting into the voucher system. So do we have to address the super PAC issue? And the reason it becomes important for the court to recognize dependence corruption is that I don't think the court has actually answered that question if the court conceived of an idea of dependence corruption distinct from quid pro quo corruption. That was the issue that was raised in the speech now. The DC Circuit said it follows from Citizens United that limits on independent political action committees are also unconstitutional. But I don't think it follows from Citizens United with a proper understanding of what corruption is that independent political action committees cannot be restricted at all. I think it might follow from Citizens United you can't tell the Koch brothers that they're not allowed to write a check for $10 million and buy a bunch of ads. That might follow from that. But I do think dependence corruption suggests that these things like independent political action committees that become kind of extortion rackets, which signal to candidates which way they have to behave in order to make sure that they're not attacked or they are supported if they do get attacked, those things do directly implicate what I'm talking about as dependence corruption. So the court would have to recognize that conception in order to uphold regulations like a regulation that would try to reinstate what speech now did. And it also gives a sense to why what the Congress would do with vouchers, for example, would be advancing a significant public interest, and the interest would be to eliminate this kind of dependence corruption.
I was wondering about the extent to which you believe there are diminishing returns on campaign contributions. For the simple reason that if there are, it's not as if that solves the problem or makes this an issue you shouldn't still consider, but it does, for lack of a better way to put it, sort of set an upper limit on how bad things can get with money, and if we can sort of identify points at which, campaign contributions may do more damage or less, we can perhaps use that to sort of strategize and prioritize and sort of set concrete policy goals.
Yeah, this I think is a version of the question of what if we could lower the cost of campaigns. So what you're saying is what if we could lower the amount we have to spend on campaigns or have to raise for campaigns because it turns out the last $1 billion is not really worth the effort. And the answer in both cases is that might be true. I think this campaign demonstrated that. I think the Romney campaign in particular found that the last 3 weeks they're getting no return from their advertising because people just tuned out. They were so bombarded by television advertising, they didn't have a reason to, they didn't want to listen anymore. So the strategy might say, tune it back, do it more slowly, do it earlier, whatever. But regardless of that, there still is the underlying question of how you're actually raising whatever money you need to raise. So I think it's really important to distinguish between one debate, which is how much does money actually buy you? Does it really buy you victory? There are lots of ways to look at that, and the answer is contested in lots of the questions. From the question which I'm focusing on, which is what does it do to a candidate to spend all of his time focused on the problem of raising money? That's the issue that I care about, not what does the money buy. One very dramatic example from this election, Barack Obama had 101 public rallies. He had 221 fundraisers. Ronald Reagan, in his second term, had 0 fundraisers. 0 fundraisers. And I don't say that because I love Ronald Reagan. I don't know if I do anymore. But my point is, Ronald Reagan lived under public funding, right? He was the candidate who benefited the most from public funding. In the history of public funding, he ran 3 national campaigns with public funding. And in the context of public funding, he didn't have to spend any of his time focused on this question of fundraising. He spent all of his time talking to people. And it's the difference, and that's the difference that I think we have to find a better way to focus on. What do we produce in legislators when legislators are just obsessed with this narrow question of how do I keep the Lesters happy as opposed to keeping the rest of us happy?
The presentations last night and today suggest that there are multiple structural anomalies that we have to deal with to correct this problem. And as a friend of Article 5 convention, you and I have long agreed that in order to achieve these endpoints, we're going to have to pass constitutional amendments that address many of these structural anomalies. You just alluded to the fact that sloganeering has had some unintended consequences in terms of how people think about this process. So my question is methodological. I don't think that we're ever going to get such a constitutional amendment through Congress as has been, given all the disincentives here that you pointed to in the obstructionist payment. So I'm curious about where you think we ought to go and how to force Congress to call an Article 5 convention so we can actually address this at the constitutional level where it has to structurally be addressed.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear about just how pessimistic we should be about Congress actually addressing this. Jim Cooper, who's been in Congress for as long as all about 20 other members of Congress, characterized it to me like this. He said, you have to understand Congress has become, Capitol Hill has become the kind of farm league for K Street. And what he means is members and staffers and bureaucrats have this common business model. Their business model focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. And they focus on their life as lobbyists because lobbying is extremely lucrative. And lobbying is extremely lucrative because, in part, of its relationship to the way we fund campaigns. The most interesting statistic I found when I wrote my book was that in 1972, the average salary of a lobbyist was the same as an average salary of a staffer on Capitol Hill. The same, because they were just policy wonks. Right? But when they begin to be both policy wonks and central points in the funding mechanism, they're more valuable. And so if you have a system where everybody just expects, we're going to do my time and then cash out and become a lobbyist, very few of those people are going to be keen to fundamentally change the economy of lobbying and therefore destroy their future. So I think the idea of inside the Beltway change here is hopeless. And that's why I do agree in a kind of Jefferson-Madison sense with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. So we've got to find a way to go outside, right? Get the states to rally for the kind of change that has to happen. And that introduces the Article 5 convention, which is a long conversation. Because I think at least a couple of us are satisfied with the risks and the returns of this, but I think most people are terrified by it. But I am somebody who believes that at least the pressure that gets created by states counting, being counted on their way to an Article 5 convention would be enormously helpful to getting Congress to actually try to do something about it. So we have an organization that's got liberals and conservatives. It's about to launch that is facilitating this process. Vermont, Massachusetts, and the Wolfpack people here in Texas have gotten resolutions introduced in these states to call for an Article 5 convention. And there's conservatives that have been doing this much more extensively around balanced budget issues. So I think this is a process that will go forward, but let's just flag the fact there are a million questions. People have legitimate questions that have to be addressed, and in 30 seconds we can't address them.
The last question goes to Megan.
So I'm just one of the many people relieved that I spoke before you rather than after. I pity the rest of the panel for the afternoon. I'm trying to be part of the pushback crowd. I think you're way too sunny about the prospect that the Supreme Court is going to accept this theory. So you should, in some ways, I feel like you're parsing that opinion like a statute. And you should never parse an opinion like a statute. It's true that in that opinion, they don't say exactly what you say in rejecting your theory. On the other hand, if we are going to parse a case like a statute, at least one sentence stands out for me, which is ingratiation and access are not corruption. More importantly, if you look at the overarching narrative of the Supreme Court's jurisprudence here, they had tons and tons of evidence of the dependence theory, the Lessig theory, in a case of King Humble. And since then, they've willy-nilly taken advantage of their 5% majority and taken it down despite extensive evidence of the Lessig theory and record by Congress and the court's own decision. So I don't even know why you need to do it. You're playing the long game. The long game involves actuarial tables and Democratic majority, including in House floor nominees. But I don't buy that this court is going to accept the theory you do. It's even the more liberal courts we've had have been very reluctant to use Austin because it's such a big and expensive theory. And the Lessig theory has been available for a long time, and it's not on this part.
So I guess I push back on the claim, on the pushback. I push back on the pushback that the Lessig theory has been framed in this way. I think my claim is that first, the alternative to quid pro quo has been too expansive. It's been the equality conception. So I don't actually think it's been framed or considered. There's one brief that raises it in the Arizona case, but they didn't need to think about it in the Arizona case. Okay. But the second, but you know, what's the dynamic I'm expecting here? You're right. If there are 5 members of this Supreme Court who look at our system of election and think, yeah, this is great, this is sunny, this is fantastic, what we've done is super, nothing I'm saying would compel them to change their mind, absolutely. But what I expect is that there's at least one who looks at what has happened and thinks, whoa, I'm not really excited about what's been produced here. And then what that one might say to his clerk is there a way for me to affirm what I did before, but actually find a way to address what has grown out of this mess? And all I'm saying is the answer is yes, there is. There's a way to say Citizens United was rightly decided in the sense that, of course, nonprofit has a First Amendment right to spend their money to promote their film. Of course, the idea of independent expenditures, if truly independent in this sense, creates a different kind of issue of corruption. But the system of funding we've developed where we can see the pattern of attention is focused on this tiny little group creates what I'm calling independence corruption. And more importantly for this particular justice, at least in some of his modes of thinking, this I think is the strongest originalist view for worrying about corruption. Like the framers of the Constitution were not thinking about Blagojevich. That's not who they were worried about. Like the structure of incentives that they're setting up, the kind of corruption that they're worried about when they look at the British Crown is the institutional corruption, the way in which one institution has the opportunity to corrupt another institution by the loyalties they can build in. They start thinking about this in a more general sense. And that's exactly the kind of corruption I'm talking about here. So I would say to, not the justice I worked for, because I don't think he listens on this issue, but at least another justice in that court, I would say a good originalist could say the thing they're worried about is exactly this kind of distracting dependency. And there's completely legitimate reason for Congress to try to protect itself from this distracting dependency. And so therefore, Congress does have the power to enact a kind of legislation that would, for example, try to overturn speech now. And if you want to do this, there's nothing you've done before that you need to step back from. And so that's the only point that I'm making. But you're right, obviously. What we're trying to do is create a long-term conception of why it's right to address this kind of corruption. It's right to address this kind of corruption, consistent with the idea of creating a government, a republic, that is responsive to the different type of dependencies which a legitimately independent government ought to be responsive to.
Before we thank Larry, let me remind you that we will reconvene promptly at 2:15 in the Eidman courtroom. The next panel is The People's Branch, Is Congress Hopeless? But